The desert wind carried secrets across the barren landscape of Salvation Creek, a forgotten town where dreams came to die and legends were born in blood. This is the story of two brothers, born under the same stars, but destined to walk opposite sides of the law, whose paths would cross one final time in a showdown that would shake the very foundations of justice itself. 28 years ago, on a night when lightning split the sky like God's own fury, Margaret Sullivan gave birth to twin boys in a cramped cabin on the outskirts of what would later become Salvation Creek. The midwife, old Clara Hawthorne, would later swear she saw something in those babies' eyes that chilled her to the bone, one pair as clear and blue as a mountain stream, the other dark and stormy as a midnight sky. The boys were named Samuel and Solomon after the biblical kings. But fate, it seemed, had darker plans than their mother could ever imagine. When the twins were barely 3 years old, a band of outlaws led by the notorious Black Jack Morrison swept through their settlement like a plague of locusts. The raid was swift and merciless. Houses burned, men fell, and when the smoke cleared, Margaret Sullivan lay dead in her own doorway, clutching a photograph of her boys to her chest. In the chaos that followed, the twins were separated. Samuel, the fair-haired boy with eyes like summer sky, was found by Sheriff William Hayes, a lawman whose own wife had died in childbirth the year before. Hayes saw something in the boy, a spark of righteousness perhaps, or maybe just a chance to fill the void in his own heart. He took Samuel home to Tombstone, Arizona, where he raised him as his own son. In the chaos that followed, the twins were separated. Samuel, the fair-haired boy with eyes like summer sky, was found by Sheriff William Hayes, a lawman whose own wife had died in childbirth the year before. Hayes saw something in the boy, a spark of righteousness perhaps, or maybe just a chance to fill the void in his own heart. He took Samuel home to Tombstone, Arizona, where he raised him as his own son. Solomon, dark-haired and fierce even as a toddler, wasn't so fortunate. He was taken by Black Jack Morrison himself, who saw potential in the boy's defiant glare. Morrison had no children of his own, and in Solomon he found the perfect protege. The outlaw raised the boy in camps and hideouts, teaching him to shoot before he could properly read, to steal before he understood what honesty meant. For 25 years, the brothers lived separate lives, unaware of each other's existence. Samuel Hayes became everything his adoptive father hoped: a lawman with an unshakable moral compass, a man who believed in justice above all else. He earned his badge at 21, became deputy sheriff at 23, and by 25, he was the youngest sheriff in Arizona Territory. Solomon Morrison, for he had taken his outlaw father's name, became something else entirely. He was a ghost in the night, a shadow that struck without warning. His gang, known as the Devil's Own, terrorized settlements from Texas to California. Banks, trains, stagecoaches, nothing was safe from Solomon's reach. He was faster with a gun than chain lightning and twice as deadly. The law had been hunting Solomon Morrison for over a decade. Wanted posters bearing his likeness were nailed to every tree and telegraph pole from Denver to El Paso. The reward for his capture, dead or alive, had grown to $10,000, more money than most men would see in 3 lifetimes. But Solomon was smart. He never stayed in one place long enough for the law to catch up. He changed his appearance regularly, used false names, and trusted no one completely. His gang was loyal because he paid them well and killed anyone who betrayed him without hesitation. The only constant in Solomon's life was the strange dreams that plagued him, visions of a brother he'd never known, fragments of a childhood that felt like someone else's memories. He would wake in cold sweats, seeing a face that looked like his own but somehow different, cleaner, unmarked by the violence that had shaped his world. Samuel had similar dreams, though he interpreted them differently. He saw them as visions of what he might have become if he'd chosen a different path. His adoptive father, Sheriff Hayes, had taught him that every man faces the choice between good and evil, and Samuel believed these nightmares were his conscience reminding him to stay true to his principles. The collision course that would bring the brothers together began with a train robbery outside Tucson. Solomon's gang hit the Southern Pacific Express, making off with $50,000 in gold, bound for the California Mint. But this wasn't just any robbery. The train also carried Sarah Mitchell, daughter of railroad magnate Charles Mitchell, who was traveling to her wedding in San Francisco. Sarah was beautiful, intelligent, and completely unimpressed by Solomon's reputation. When he burst into her private car, guns blazing and bandana covering his face, she looked him straight in the eye and told him he was making a mistake. There was something about her fearlessness that stopped Solomon cold. Instead of taking her for ransom as planned, he found himself oddly protective of her. The robbery should have been simple. Get in, take the gold, get out. But something went wrong. A hidden guard opened fire, wounding one of Solomon's men. In the confusion, Sarah Mitchell disappeared into the desert night, fleeing on horseback toward the nearest town. That town was Salvation Creek, where Sheriff Samuel Hayes had just arrived to investigate reports of rustlers in the area. When Sarah stumbled into his office, exhausted and terrified, Samuel knew immediately that he was facing something bigger than cattle theft. The description she gave of the lead outlaw sent chills down his spine, not because he recognized the man, but because something about it felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Samuel organized a posse to track the outlaws, but Solomon was already gone, vanished into the maze of canyons and badlands that surrounded Salvation Creek like a fortress. The only trace he left behind was a single bullet casing stamped with the initials SM, Solomon Morrison's calling card. What Samuel didn't know was that Solomon hadn't gone far. Something about Salvation Creek called to him, a sense of homecoming he couldn't understand. He made camp in the ruins of an old cabin about 5 miles outside town, not realizing it was the same cabin where he and his brother had been born. For 3 days, the brothers circled each other like wolves, neither knowing how close they were to their destiny. Samuel searched the desert by day, following cold trails and false leads. Solomon watched the town from the shadows, studying its defenses and planning his next move. He told himself he was scouting for another job, but the truth was something else entirely. On the 4th day, Solomon made a decision that would change everything. Instead of riding away to plan another score, he decided to rob the first bank of Salvation Creek. It wasn't about the money. The bank was small and probably held less than what he'd taken from the train. It was about the challenge, about proving to himself that no lawman could touch him. But as Solomon studied the bank from across the street, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The sheriff emerging from the building looked exactly like him. Not similar, identical. The same height, the same build, the same features. The only differences were the badge on the man's chest and the absence of scars that marked Solomon's face. For a moment, both men stood frozen in the dusty street, staring at each other across 20 yards of packed earth. The town around them seemed to fade away, leaving only two figures locked in a moment that had been 25 years in the making. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but something held him back. This wasn't just another outlaw. This was something impossible, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. The spell broke when a child ran between them, chasing a ball into the street. Both men blinked, the moment shattered, and Solomon melted back into the crowd while Samuel stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He paced his small office, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. In desperation, he pulled out the one possession he had from his childhood, a small silver locket that Sheriff Hayes had found clutched in his tiny fist the night he was rescued. Inside was a photograph so faded he'd never been able to make out the faces clearly. But now, holding it up to the lamplight, Samuel could see what he'd missed before. The photograph showed a young woman holding two babies, twins. The resemblance to the outlaw he'd seen was unmistakable. Meanwhile, Solomon was having his own moment of revelation. In his saddlebags, he carried the only thing Blackjack Morrison had never been able to steal from him, a small wooden cross his birth mother had pressed into his hand the night she died. He'd kept it all these years without knowing why, but now, sitting in the ruins of his childhood home, he felt compelled to examine it more closely. Carved into the back of the cross, almost too faint to see, were two names, Samuel and Solomon Sullivan. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but neither brother was ready to accept the truth. Samuel spent the next day asking questions around town, trying to learn more about the history of Salvation Creek. The old-timers remembered the raid 25 years ago, remembered the Sullivan family and the tragedy that befell them. Clara Hawthorne, now in her 80s and nearly blind, was still alive and living above the general store. When Samuel described the man he'd seen, she gripped his arm with surprising strength. "The Sullivan boys," she whispered. "I delivered them myself. Twins they were, born in that old cabin out by Devil's Canyon. I always wondered what became of them after the raid." Solomon, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation. He broke into the town's records office and found the birth certificate. Margaret Sullivan, twin boys born October 13th, 1855. The same date on his own forged papers. But knowledge and acceptance were two different things. Both men struggled with the implications of what they'd learned. Samuel had built his entire identity around being the good son, the lawman who stood for justice. How could he reconcile that with having a twin brother who was a cold-blooded killer? Solomon's struggle was different, but equally profound. He'd spent his life believing he was alone, that the world was against him, and violence was the only language anyone understood. The idea that he had a brother who'd chosen law over lawlessness, shook the very foundations of his worldview. The confrontation came sooner than either expected. Solomon's presence in Salvation Creek hadn't gone unnoticed by bounty hunters. 3 men arrived in town. Jake "Killer" Kane, a former Confederate soldier who collected scalps as trophies, Miguel Santos, a Mexican gunslinger with 47 confirmed kills, and Thomas Reed, a cold-blooded killer who took contracts from anyone willing to pay his price. They'd tracked Solomon to Salvation Creek and planned to take him, dead or alive, preferably dead, since corpses didn't fight back when it came time to collect the reward. The three men made their move at high noon, the traditional time for showdowns in the Old West. They spread out across Main Street, blocking both ends and the middle, trapping Solomon in the saloon where he'd been drowning his sorrows in whiskey. But they hadn't counted on Sheriff Samuel Hayes. When Samuel saw the three gunmen take their positions, he knew instantly what was happening, despite everything, despite the fact that the man in the saloon was a wanted criminal, despite the reward money, despite his duty as a lawman. Samuel couldn't stand by and watch his brother be gunned down by mercenaries. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to risk his life to save a man who'd spent years killing people like him. Samuel stepped into the street, his badge gleaming in the desert sun. "This is Sheriff Hayes," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent town. "I'm placing Solomon Morrison under arrest. Anyone who interferes will be dealt with according to the law." Jake Kane laughed, a harsh sound like grinding glass. "Step aside, Sheriff. This ain't your fight. We got legal papers on Morrison, dead or alive. You can have whatever's left when we're done." "I said step aside." Samuel's hand rested on his gun butt, and despite being outnumbered 3-1, there was no fear in his voice. He'd made his choice. Inside the saloon, Solomon heard the exchange and felt something he hadn't experienced in 25 years. Someone was willing to stand up for him. Not for money, not for personal gain, but simply because it was the right thing to do. For the first time in his adult life, Solomon Morrison felt ashamed of what he'd become. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then Thomas Reed made his move, going for his gun with the speed that had made him famous across 3 territories. He was fast, but Samuel was faster. The sheriff's Colt cleared leather and fired in one smooth motion, sending Reed spinning to the ground with a bullet through his shoulder. The shot was the signal for chaos. Miguel Santos and Jake Kane opened fire simultaneously, bullets whining through the air like angry hornets. Samuel dove behind a water trough, splinters flying as the bounty hunter's shots found wood instead of flesh. That's when Solomon Morrison stepped out of the saloon. He walked calmly into the street, his twin Colt peacemakers hanging at his sides. The bounty hunters turned their attention to him, sensing easier prey than the sheriff who'd already proven his skill. They were wrong. Solomon's guns seemed to appear in his hands like magic. The left one spoke first, sending Jake Kane stumbling backward with a slug through his chest. The right one followed a split second later, catching Miguel Santos between the eyes before the Mexican could get off another shot. In less than 3 seconds, 2 of the most feared killers in the Southwest were lying dead in the dust of Main Street. Thomas Reed, wounded but still dangerous, tried to bring his gun to bear on Solomon. But Samuel's second shot took him in the heart, ending the threat permanently. Silence fell over Salvation Creek like a burial shroud. The 2 brothers stood in the empty street, surrounded by bodies and gun smoke, facing each other across the space where their destinies had finally intersected. Samuel holstered his gun slowly, never taking his eyes off his twin. "Why?" he asked simply. Solomon's guns disappeared back into their holsters with the same fluid motion that had drawn them. "Because you stood up for me when nobody else would. Because you risked everything for a man you didn't even know was your brother." "I knew," Samuel said quietly. "Maybe I didn't want to admit it, but I knew." The conversation that followed would be remembered by the people of Salvation Creek for generations. The two brothers sat on the steps of the sheriff's office, talking through the afternoon and into the evening, piecing together the story of their shared past and separate destinies. Samuel told Solomon about growing up with Sheriff Hayes, about learning right from wrong, about the pride he felt in wearing a badge and protecting innocent people. Solomon spoke of his life with Black Jack Morrison, of learning that strength was the only thing that mattered, of years spent running from the law and from himself. But as they talked, both men began to understand something profound. They weren't just brothers. They were two halves of the same whole, separated by circumstance and raised to represent opposing forces in the eternal struggle between law and chaos. "I've done things," Solomon said, as the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. "Terrible things. I've killed men who didn't deserve to die. I've stolen from families who needed what little they had. I've become exactly what Black Jack Morrison wanted me to become." Samuel nodded slowly. "And I've done what Sheriff Hayes taught me to do. I've protected the innocent, upheld the law, tried to make the world a little more just. But I've also killed men, Solomon. Maybe they deserved it. Maybe they didn't. But they're just as dead. The difference is, you sleep at night." "Do I? You'd be surprised how many ghosts visit a lawman's dreams." As darkness fell over Salvation Creek, the brothers faced the hardest decision of their lives. Samuel couldn't simply let Solomon go, not with all the blood on his hands, not with all the crimes he'd committed, but he also couldn't bring himself to arrest his own brother, the only family he had left in the world. Solomon faced his own dilemma. He could run, disappear into the night as he'd done countless times before, but where would it lead? More robberies, more killing, more years of loneliness and violence. Or he could stay and face the consequences of his choices, knowing it would likely mean a rope or a firing squad. The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah Mitchell, the railroad heiress who'd escaped during the train robbery, arrived in Salvation Creek with a proposal that would change everything. She'd spent the days since her escape thinking about her encounter with Solomon, about the strange moment when their eyes met, and she saw something in him that didn't match his reputation. She'd also heard about the shootout with the bounty hunters and the revelation of the brothers' relationship. Sarah was a practical woman, educated and intelligent, with her father's head for business. She saw an opportunity where others saw only problems. "The railroad needs protection," she told the brothers as they sat in Samuel's office. "Bandits, Indians, claim jumpers, the dangers are constant, and the company loses thousands of dollars every month to theft and sabotage." Samuel frowned. "The railroad has their own security force, and they're useless. They're either too slow to catch the criminals or too corrupt to care. What we need is someone who thinks like a criminal, but acts like a lawman." She looked directly at Solomon as she spoke. "I'm offering you a job, Mr. Morrison, Chief of Railroad Security for the Southern Pacific's Arizona operations. The pay is good, the work is dangerous, and it might just give you a chance to use your skills for something other than lining your own pockets. Solomon stared at her in amazement. Lady, you're offering to hire the most wanted man in 3 territories to protect your railroad. Either you're crazy or you're smarter than anyone gives you credit for. Probably both, but I'm also right. You know every trick in the book because you invented half of them. You can catch thieves because you know how they think. And maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to live with yourself. The offer was tempting, but Solomon shook his head. Even if I wanted to, which I'm not saying I do, there's still the matter of all those wanted posters. The law won't just forget about $10,000 worth of reward money. That's when Samuel spoke up. What if Solomon Morrison died? Both Sarah and Solomon looked at him in confusion. I mean, officially, Samuel continued. What if the record showed that Solomon Morrison was killed in the shootout with the bounty hunters, a case of mistaken identity? The real Solomon Morrison dies, and his twin brother, let's call him Saul Sullivan, starts a new life, working for the railroad. It was a crazy plan, but crazy enough to work. The 3 bounty hunters were already dead, so they couldn't contradict the story. Samuel's reputation for honesty would lend credibility to his report, and Solomon had changed his appearance so many times over the years that few people knew exactly what he looked like anyway. There would be conditions, Samuel said firmly. Any crimes committed by Saul Sullivan would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, any backsliding into the old ways, and I'll hunt you down myself. Solomon was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the desert where he'd spent so many years running from himself and everyone else. I killed a lot of people, Samuel. Good people. Some of them. How do I live with that? The same way I live with the people I've killed in the name of the law. You try to do better. You try to make sure their deaths meant something. The transformation of Solomon Morrison into Saul Sullivan wasn't easy. Years of living outside the law had left their mark on him, not just the physical scars, but the mental ones as well. He was suspicious of everyone, ready to fight at the slightest provocation, uncomfortable with the idea of working within a system instead of against it. But Sarah Mitchell proved to be more than just a pretty face with a railroad fortune behind her. She was patient with Solomon's rough edges while being firm about her expectations. She paired him with experienced railroad men who could teach him the legitimate side of security work while learning from his extensive knowledge of criminal operations. Samuel, meanwhile, found himself in the strange position of being both brother and potential adversary. He watched Solomon's progress with a mixture of pride and wariness, ready to offer support when needed, but equally ready to fulfill his promise if his brother strayed from the straight and narrow. The first test came 6 months later, when word reached Salvation Creek that a gang was planning to rob the Southern Pacific Express near Tucson, the same route where Solomon had conducted his last robbery as an outlaw. Sarah assigned Saul Sullivan to handle the situation, knowing full well the irony of sending a former train robber to prevent a train robbery. Solomon tracked the gang to their hideout in the Superstition Mountains, using skills he'd learned from Blackjack Morrison, but applying them in service of the law for the first time in his life. The confrontation was swift and decisive. 2 outlaws dead, 3 captured, and the train robbery prevented without a single shot being fired at innocent passengers. When Samuel read the report, he felt something he'd never experienced before: pride in his brother's accomplishments. But the real test was yet to come. Blackjack Morrison was getting old, but he wasn't dead. The legendary outlaw had been laying low in Mexico, nursing wounds from a failed bank robbery and plotting his return to the territories. When word reached him that his adopted son Solomon had supposedly died in a shootout with bounty hunters, he was filled with a cold rage that demanded vengeance. Morrison gathered what remained of his old gang and crossed the border into Arizona, intent on making the town of Salvation Creek pay for killing the boy he'd raised as his own son. He had no idea that Solomon was still alive or that he'd switched sides in the eternal war between law and chaos. The attack came at dawn, just like the raid 25 years earlier that had started it all. Blackjack and 15 heavily armed men rode into Salvation Creek with guns blazing and torches ready, intent on burning the town to the ground. But this time, the town was ready. Samuel had received word from his network of lawmen that Morrison was moving north, and he'd spent weeks preparing Salvation Creek's defenses. The townspeople were armed and positioned, the buildings were fortified, and most importantly, he had backup he could count on. Saul Sullivan arrived in town the night before the attack, officially there on railroad business, but actually drawn by the same instincts that had kept him alive through years of outlaw life. He knew Blackjack Morrison better than anyone, knew how the old man thought and how he fought. The battle for Salvation Creek was fierce and bloody. Morrison's men were experienced killers, hardened by years of violence and motivated by loyalty to their leader. But they were fighting on unfamiliar ground against defenders who had everything to lose. Samuel coordinated the town's defense from the sheriff's office, his tactical skills honed by years of tracking criminals through hostile territory. Saul worked the shadows, using guerrilla tactics to pick off Morrison's men one by one, his intimate knowledge of outlaw psychology giving him a crucial advantage. The fight raged for 3 hours, from dawn until the desert sun climbed high enough to turn the battlefield into a furnace. Bodies littered Main Street, and the smell of gunpowder and blood hung heavy in the air. But gradually, the tide turned in favor of the defenders. By midday, most of Morrison's men were either dead or wounded. The old outlaw himself had taken refuge in the abandoned cabin where the Sullivan twins had been born, the same cabin where Saul had made his camp when he first returned to Salvation Creek. The final confrontation was inevitable. Saul insisted on going alone, despite Samuel's protests. This was personal, a reckoning 25 years in the making between the man who had shaped Solomon Morrison and the man he had become. Saul found Blackjack in the ruins of the cabin, wounded but still dangerous, his weathered face twisted with grief and rage. "You look just like him, you know," the old outlaw said, mistaking Saul for his brother Samuel. "Just like my boy Solomon. I raised that boy from a pup, taught him everything he knew. He was going to be the greatest outlaw who ever lived." Saul stepped into the cabin, his guns holstered but ready. "He was never your boy, Morrison. He was Margaret Sullivan's son, stolen from his family and twisted into something he was never meant to be." Recognition dawned in Blackjack's eyes as he took in Saul's appearance more carefully. The scars, the way he carried himself, the cold competence that no lawman could fake. "Solomon, but you're supposed to be dead. I came here to avenge you, boy." "Solomon Morrison is dead. I killed him myself when I decided to become something better than what you made me." The old outlaw's face went through a range of emotions: confusion, betrayal, and finally, a terrible understanding. "You turned," he whispered. "You turned against everything I taught you, against everything we stood for. You never taught me anything worth learning, Jack. You taught me to kill, to steal, to hate, but you never taught me how to live with myself afterward." Black Jack Morrison reached for his gun, but age and wounds had slowed him down. Sol's Colt cleared leather first, the shot echoing through the cabin like thunder. The legendary outlaw fell backward, his gun unfired, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling where he'd once planned raids and counted stolen gold. The man who had shaped the most feared criminal in the Southwest was dead, killed by the very monster he'd created. Saul holstered his weapon and walked outside, where Samuel was waiting with a look of concern and understanding. "It's over," Sewell said simply. "For him, maybe, but not for us." The brothers buried Black Jack Morrison in an unmarked grave outside Salvation Creek, far from the cemetery where decent folks were laid to rest. They said no words over the grave, offered no prayers for his soul. Some men didn't deserve remembrance. In the weeks that followed, Saul Sullivan's reputation as a railroad detective grew throughout the territory. His success rate in stopping robberies and catching thieves was unprecedented, partly because of his skills, but mostly because he understood the criminal mind better than any lawman had a right to. Samuel continued his work as sheriff of Salvation Creek, but now he had something he'd never had before: family. The brothers met regularly, sometimes to coordinate their efforts against criminal gangs, sometimes just to talk about their lives and their past. Sarah Mitchell became a frequent visitor to Salvation Creek, officially to check on the railroad's interests, but actually because she found herself drawn to the man who had been Solomon Morrison and was becoming Saul Sullivan. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than passion or convenience. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. 3 years after the death of Black Jack Morrison, a new threat emerged from the shadows of the Arizona Territory. Marcus the Ghost Valente was everything that Solomon Morrison had been but worse. Smarter, more ruthless, and completely without conscience. He'd been building a criminal empire while staying carefully out of sight, and now he was ready to make his move. Valente had heard the stories about Saul Sullivan, the railroad detective who thought like a criminal, and he'd done his research. He knew about the connection between Saul and Sheriff Samuel Hayes, knew about their shared past and their current cooperation. More dangerously, he'd figured out who Saul Sullivan really was. The first sign of trouble came when a Southern Pacific train was robbed near Phoenix, but not in the usual way. Instead of taking the money and running, the thieves had left behind a message written in blood on the side of a freight car. "Solomon Morrison sends his regards." Saul knew immediately what was happening. Someone was trying to frame him for the robbery, to destroy the new life he'd built and drive a wedge between him and his brother. The question was who and what they ultimately wanted. The answer came in the form of a letter delivered to both brothers simultaneously. Marcus Valente was challenging them to a final showdown, not just a gunfight, but a test of everything they stood for. The letter explained Valente's plan in chilling detail. He had kidnapped a dozen innocent people from towns throughout the territory, men, women, and children whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was holding them in an abandoned mining camp in the Dragoon Mountains, the same area where Cochise and his Apache warriors had once made their stand against the U.S. Army. Valente's challenge was simple but diabolical. The brothers could come to the mining camp alone and unarmed and face him in single combat. If they won, the hostages would go free. If they lost, everyone would die, and Valente would use their deaths as the foundation for a criminal empire that would make Blackjack Morrison's gang look like choir boys. But there was a catch. Only one of the brothers could face Valente. The other would have to watch, unable to help, as his sibling fought for the lives of innocent people. It was a perfect trap, designed to exploit the one thing that could destroy the bond between the brothers, their love for each other. Both men immediately volunteered to be the one to face Valente, and for the first time since their reunion, they found themselves on opposite sides of an argument. Samuel insisted it was his duty as a lawman to protect the innocent. Sewell argued that this was his responsibility, that his past as Solomon Morrison had brought this threat into their lives. The argument raged for hours, neither brother willing to back down. Finally, Sarah Mitchell proposed a solution that was as elegant as it was dangerous. They would flip a coin. Heads, Samuel would face Valente while Saul watched. Tails, Saul would take the challenge while Samuel stood by helplessly. The coin spun through the air, catching the lamplight in Samuel's office before landing with a soft clink on his desk. Tails. The journey to the Dragoon Mountains was made in silence, both brothers lost in their own thoughts. Samuel struggled with the idea of letting his brother face this danger alone, while Sewell grappled with the possibility that he might not survive to see another sunrise. As they rode through the desert, they passed landmarks that held memories for both of them. The cabin where they'd been born, the canyon where Sewell had hidden during his outlaw days, the mesa where Samuel had tracked his first criminal as a deputy sheriff. It was a landscape shaped by violence and survival, where men were measured by their courage and their ability to face impossible odds. In many ways, it was the perfect place for the story of the Sullivan brothers to reach its conclusion. The abandoned mining camp sat in a natural bowl surrounded by towering red rocks, accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended or turned into a killing ground. Valente had chosen his battleground well. As the brothers approached the camp, they could see signs of habitation. Smoke rising from buildings that should have been empty, horses tied to posts, armed men moving between the structures. This wasn't going to be a simple duel between Sewell and Valente. The Ghost had brought an army, but they'd expected that. Saul Sullivan hadn't survived this long by trusting the word of criminals, and Samuel Hayes hadn't built his reputation by walking unprepared into obvious traps. The plan they'd worked out was risky but simple. Sewell would enter the camp openly, following Valente's rules and appearing to honor the challenge. Samuel would circle around through the rocks and approach from the rear, ready to provide backup when the inevitable betrayal occurred. As Sewell rode into the mining camp, he could feel the weight of hostile eyes watching his every move. Valente's men were positioned throughout the settlement, armed with rifles and ready to cut him down at the first sign of treachery. But Sewell had been in situations like this before, back when he was Solomon Morrison, and he knew how to project confidence even when facing impossible odds. Marcus Valente was waiting for him in the center of the camp, standing beside a gallows that had been hastily constructed for the occasion. The ghost was younger than Sewell had expected, maybe 35, with a kind of pale skin that suggested he spent more time in shadow than sunlight. But his eyes were older than his face, filled with a cold intelligence that marked him as far more dangerous than the usual breed of outlaw. Around the gallows, tied to posts and guarded by armed men, were the hostages Valente had promised. Sewell counted 12 people, men, women, and children ranging in age from 8 to 60. They were frightened but unharmed, which meant Valente was keeping his word so far. "Solomon Morrison!" Valente called out, his voice carrying easily across the camp. "The legendary train robber, come back from the dead. I have to admit, I'm impressed by your resurrection. Not many men can change their entire identity and make it stick." Sewell dismounted slowly, his hands well away from his guns. "The name's Saul Sullivan now. Solomon Morrison died 3 years ago in Salvation Creek." Valente laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Names are just words, Morrison. You can call yourself whatever you like, but we both know what you really are. A killer, a thief, a man who spent his life taking whatever he wanted, and damn the consequences." "Maybe I was. But that doesn't mean I have to stay that way." "Oh, but it does. That's the beauty of it, don't you see? You can pretend to be respectable. You can work for the railroad and play house with that pretty heiress. But deep down, you'll always be the man I am now. The only difference is that I'm honest about it." The philosophical debate was interrupted by a commotion from the rocks surrounding the camp. Samuel had been spotted by one of Valente's sentries, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as the sheriff fought his way through the defensive positions. Valente smiled coldly. "Your brother always was predictable. Did you really think I'd believe you'd come alone? I've been planning this for months, Morrison. I know everything about you, everything about him, everything about your touching reunion and your new life as one of the good guys." More gunshots rang out from the perimeter, getting closer, but also drawing return fire from Valente's men. Samuel was good, but he was outnumbered at least 10 to 1. "Here's what's going to happen," Valente continued, drawing his gun with practiced ease. "You and I are going to have our duel just like I promised. But when your brother shows up to help, and he will because that's the kind of man he is, my boys are going to cut him down like a dog. Then I'm going to kill these nice folks here one by one while you watch. And finally, I'm going to put a bullet in your head and take over every criminal operation from here to California." Sewell felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same feeling that had kept Solomon Morrison alive through countless gunfights and desperate situations. His hands moved to his gun butts, not drawing yet, but ready. "You made one mistake, Valente." "And what's that?" "You assumed I came here to play by your rules." Sewell's guns cleared leather faster than human eyes could follow, both Colts speaking in perfect unison. The first shot took out the guard holding a rifle on the hostages. The second dropped a gunman who was drawing down on Saul from behind a wagon. But Valente was fast, too, faster than anyone Sewell had faced since his outlaw days. The ghost's bullet whined past Sewell's ear, close enough to burn, as both men dove for cover behind the makeshift gallows. The mining camp erupted into chaos. Gunfire crackled from every direction as Valente's men engaged targets they couldn't clearly see. The hostages screamed and tried to take cover. their ropes preventing them from fleeing, but not from becoming casualties in the crossfire. Saul rolled behind a pile of mining equipment, his mind automatically calculating angles and distances. He could hear Samuel's guns firing from the rocks above, getting closer, but still too far away to provide immediate help. The sheriff was fighting his way through at least 8 men, maybe more, and even his legendary skill had limits. A bullet sparked off the iron wheel beside Saul's head, reminding him that philosophy was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. He returned fire, dropping another of Valente's men, but there were still too many of them and not enough cover. That's when the unexpected happened. Sarah Mitchell appeared at the mouth of the canyon, leading a dozen railroad security men armed with repeating rifles. She'd followed the brothers despite their protests, bringing backup that neither man had known was coming. The tide of battle shifted in an instant. Valente's men found themselves caught between Saul's guns, Samuel's approach from above, and Sarah's reinforcements from the canyon mouth. The superior numbers that had seemed so overwhelming were suddenly meaningless. But Marcus Valente wasn't finished. As his men fell around him, he grabbed the nearest hostage, a young girl, maybe 10 years old, and pressed his gun to her head. "That's enough!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Everyone stop shooting, or the girl dies." The gunfire ceased abruptly, leaving only the echo of shots and the whimpering of the terrified child. Saul emerged from cover, his hands raised but his guns still ready. "Let her go, Valente. Your fight is with me." "My fight is with everything you represent," Valente snarled. "You think you can just change sides? Think you can wash the blood off your hands by pinning on a badge and playing hero? I've killed 43 men, Morrison. How many have you killed? 50? 60? More?" Saul took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the gun pressed against the child's temple. "I don't know. I stopped counting years ago, but every single one of them haunts me. Every face, every name I knew, every family I destroyed. That's the difference between us, Ghost. You're proud of what you've done. I'm trying to make up for it." Pretty words, but they don't bring back the dead. No, they don't. Nothing can do that. But maybe I can prevent a few more from joining them. Samuel had worked his way down from the rocks and was approaching from Valente's blind side, but the angle was wrong. Any shot he took risked hitting the hostage. Sarah's men had similar problems. Valente had positioned himself perfectly, using the child as a human shield while keeping all his enemies in front of him. Saul was the only one with a clear shot, but it would have to be perfect. One mistake, one fraction of an inch off, and an innocent child would die for his failures. The standoff stretched into minutes, sweat beading on everyone's faces despite the desert cold. Valente's gun hand was starting to shake. Whether from strain or nerves, Saul couldn't tell. "You want to know what your real mistake was?" Saul said quietly, taking another half-step closer. "Enlighten me. You studied Solomon Morrison, but you never understood him. Morrison was a killer, sure, but he wasn't a monster. He never hurt children, never harmed women unless they were shooting at him first. There were lines even he wouldn't cross." Valente laughed harshly. "Honor among thieves? How touching. Not honor, just the last pieces of humanity that Black Jack Morrison couldn't beat out of me. And if you hurt that little girl, I'll show you what a real monster looks like." The threat was delivered in such a calm, matter-of-fact tone that it was more terrifying than any screamed curse could have been. Valente actually took a step backward, his confidence wavering for the first time. That step was what Sul had been waiting for. As Valente moved, his gun shifted away from the child's head for just a split second. It was all the opening Sul needed. His right-hand Colt fired once, the bullet taking Marcus, the ghost Valente, between the eyes and dropping him instantly. The child ran toward Sarah's men, sobbing but unharmed. Silence fell over the mining camp like a burial shroud. The last of Valente's gang were either dead or surrendering, their leader's death having taken the fight out of them. Samuel emerged from the rocks, his face grim but proud. Sarah holstered her rifle and moved to comfort the freed hostages. Sol stood over Valente's body, looking down at the man who had tried to drag him back into the darkness he'd fought so hard to escape. "It's over," Samuel said, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "This part is," Sol replied, "but there'll always be another Marcus Valente, another Blackjack Morrison, men who think strength gives them the right to prey on the weak. Then we'll deal with them when they come, together." The cleanup took most of the day. The hostages were seen to, and arrangements made to get them home to their families. Valente's surviving men were tied up and prepared for transport to the territorial prison in Yuma. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves, just as Blackjack Morrison had been. As the sun set over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, the three people who had made this victory possible sat around a small campfire, sharing a simple meal and reflecting on what they'd accomplished. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, looking at Sul with eyes that held more than professional interest. Sul was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. "I keep doing the job," he said finally. "Keep trying to make up for what I was. Keep hoping that maybe, someday, the good I do will outweigh the bad. And if it never does, then I keep trying anyway. What else is there?" Samuel smiled at his brother's answer. "Sheriff Hayes used to tell me that a man isn't defined by his worst moment, but by what he does after it. I think he'd be proud of what you've become, Sul." "What we've become," Sul corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without both of you." The brothers spent the next hour sharing stories of their adoptive fathers, comparing the lessons they'd learned from Sheriff Hayes and Blackjack Morrison, marveling at how two such different men could have shaped them into who they were today. As the fire burned low and the desert stars emerged in all their glory, Sarah excused herself to check on the prisoners one last time. When she was out of earshot, Samuel turned to his brother with a serious expression. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What's that?" "Do you ever regret it? Giving up the outlaw life, I mean. You were free then in a way. No responsibilities except to yourself, no one to answer to, no rules to follow." Saul considered the question carefully, as he did everything these days. Free to do what? Rob trains? Kill people? Sleep with one eye open every night, wondering if this would be the day someone faster than me came along? That wasn't freedom, Samuel. That was prison. A prison I'd built for myself out of anger and fear and the belief that the world owed me something. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "The funny thing is, I have more freedom now than I ever did as Solomon Morrison. Freedom to choose who I want to be. Freedom to help people instead of hurting them. Freedom to look at myself in the mirror without hating what I see." "And Sarah?" Saul's face softened at the mention of her name. "Sarah's complicated. She sees something in me that I'm not sure actually exists. Something good, something worth saving. I don't know if I'll ever be the man she thinks I can become, but I want to try. You already are that man, Soul. You proved it today and yesterday and every day since you decided to change your life. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's return, her face troubled. "We have a problem," she announced. "One of Valente's men is asking to speak with you, Soul. Says he has information about something called the Devil's Contract." Saul felt his blood run cold. The Devil's Contract was a legend among outlaws, a story told around campfires and in saloons from Texas to California. Supposedly, it was a document that contained the real names and locations of every major criminal in the Southwest, a kind of master list that could bring down dozens of gangs and hundreds of individual outlaws if it ever fell into the hands of the law. Saul had always assumed it was just a story, the kind of tall tale that grew in the telling until it became accepted as fact. But if Valente had believed in it, had been searching for it, the prisoner was a man named Jake Wheeler, a small-time gunman who'd signed on with Valente for the promise of easy money and had gotten more than he'd bargained for. He was wounded and scared, eager to trade information for leniency. Valente weren't just building a gang, Wheeler said, his voice shaky from blood loss and fear. He was planning something bigger. Said he had a line on the Devil's Contract, the real one, not some saloon story. "Where?" Sewell demanded. "Cave system in the Superstition Mountains. Place called Devil's Canyon. Same place where the Dutchman hid his gold, according to legend." Valente said the contract was hidden there by Joaquin Murrieta himself. Back in the 50s, Samuel and Sewell exchanged glances. Joaquin Murrieta was another legend, a Mexican bandit who'd terrorized California during the gold rush before supposedly being killed by lawmen. If he'd really existed, if he'd really created something like the Devil's Contract. "There's more," Wheeler continued. "Valente sent riders out 3 days ago before he brung us here. They was supposed to find the cave and secure the contract. If they succeeded, he didn't need to finish. If Valente's men had found the Devil's Contract, they now possessed information that could compromise every lawman in the territory and give the criminal underworld a massive advantage in the ongoing war between order and chaos." The decision to pursue Valente's riders into the Superstition Mountains wasn't an easy one. The area was dangerous even under the best of circumstances. A maze of canyons and peaks where Apache warriors had once held off entire army units. It was also the supposed location of the lost Dutchman's mine, which meant it was probably crawling with treasure hunters and other unsavory characters. But they couldn't ignore the possibility that the Devil's Contract was real and had fallen into the wrong hands. The three of them set out the next morning, leaving Sarah's men to transport the prisoners back to civilization. It was a risk, traveling alone into hostile territory, but they were all experienced in the ways of the desert and confident in their ability to handle whatever they might encounter. The journey to the Superstitions took 2 days of hard riding through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Arizona. The mountains rose from the desert floor like the bones of some ancient giant, their peaks shrouded in legend and their canyons hiding secrets that might be better left undisturbed. Devil's Canyon was exactly what its name suggested, a narrow gorge that twisted through the heart of the mountains like a wound in the earth itself. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating a twilight world where shadows played tricks on the eyes and every sound echoed with supernatural intensity. They found the cave 3 miles into the canyon, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but showed signs of recent disturbance. Valente's men had been here all right, and from the look of things, they'd found what they were looking for. The cave entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber that had clearly been used as a hideout for decades, possibly longer. There were the remains of old campfires, rusted metal that might once have been weapons or tools, and carved into the walls, names and dates going back to the 1850s, but no devil's contract, and no sign of Valente's riders. "They beat us to it," Samuel said grimly, examining the disturbed dirt where something had obviously been buried and then dug up. Sewell was studying the carvings on the wall, his outlaw's instincts telling him there was more to this place than met the eye. Maybe, or maybe they found something else entirely. One of the carved names caught his attention, J. Murrieta, 1853. Below it, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, were symbols that meant nothing to most people but everything to those who lived outside the law. Sewell had seen similar symbols during his years with Blackjack Morrison, a kind of code used by outlaws to leave messages for each other. This particular set of symbols indicated a cache, something hidden for future retrieval. Following the symbol's directions, Sewell found a loose stone in the cave wall. Behind it was a metal box, heavily tarnished but still intact after nearly 30 years in hiding. Inside the box was a leather-wrapped bundle that contained not one document, but dozens. Names, locations, criminal activities, law enforcement contacts. It was exactly what the legends had described. The devil's contract was real, and it was everything the stories had claimed it would be. But as Sewell examined the documents, he realized that Valente's men hadn't found this cache. The dust and spider webs around the hiding place were undisturbed except by his own hands. Whatever the riders had taken from this cave, it wasn't the devil's contract. So, what did they find? Sarah wondered aloud. The answer came in the form of gunfire from the canyon mouth. Valente's riders had been waiting for them, using the cave as bait in a trap that had been days in the making. The three companions found themselves pinned down in the cave entrance, with hostile guns commanding the only way out. It was a perfect ambush, and they'd walked right into it. But Saul Sullivan had been in worse situations during his outlaw days, and Samuel Hayes had faced impossible odds before as a lawman. Together, with Sarah's railroad training and determination, they might just find a way out of this canyon alive. The firefight that followed would be remembered as one of the most intense gun battles in the history of the Arizona Territory. 3 people trapped in a cave, holding off a dozen attackers who had every advantage except desperation. Saul used every trick he'd learned from Blackjack Morrison, every tactic that had kept Solomon Morrison alive through countless similar situations. Samuel brought his lawman's training to bear, his tactical mind finding opportunities where others saw only death. Sarah proved that her railroad security training had been more than theoretical, her rifle accounting for several of the attackers. The battle raged for hours, bullets ricocheting off canyon walls and creating a thunderous echo that could probably be heard for miles. By the time the sun reached its zenith, half of Valente's men were down, but the 3 defenders were running low on ammunition and had no way to escape their rocky prison. That's when the unexpected happened for the second time in as many days. A new group of riders appeared at the canyon mouth, not more of Valente's men, but a posse led by Sheriff Tom Bradley of Phoenix, following reports of gunfire in the Superstition Mountains. The arrival of lawmen turned the tide definitively, and the surviving attackers surrendered rather than face a hopeless fight. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke cleared, Sewell found himself holding the devil's contract and wondering what to do with it. The document represented power, the kind of information that could bring down criminal organizations throughout the Southwest and make the territory a safer place for decent people. But it also represented temptation. In the wrong hands, the same information could be used to corrupt lawmen, blackmail officials, and give criminals unprecedented leverage over the forces of law and order. The decision of what to do with the devil's contract sparked the biggest argument the Sullivan brothers had ever had. Samuel wanted to turn it over to the territorial authorities, believing that justice required the information be used to prosecute the criminals named in the document. Sewell disagreed. He'd seen enough of territorial politics to know that the contract would likely end up in the hands of people who would use it for personal gain rather than public good. He favored destroying it entirely, eliminating the temptation it represented. Sarah characteristically proposed a third option. "We keep it," she said simply, "not to use but to protect. We make sure it never falls into the wrong hands, but we also make sure it's available if the right situation arises." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but seemed preferable to the alternatives. The devil's contract was placed in a bank vault in Phoenix, with instructions that it could only be accessed by the unanimous consent of all three guardians. The aftermath of the Devil's Canyon incident marked the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of the Sullivan brothers. Saul's reputation as a railroad detective grew to legendary proportions, with criminals throughout the territory learning to fear the name Saul Sullivan almost as much as they'd once feared Solomon Morrison. Samuel continued his work as sheriff of Salvation Creek, but his jurisdiction unofficially expanded as he worked with his brother to coordinate law enforcement efforts across Arizona. The cooperation between the two brothers became a model for other lawmen, showing that former adversaries could work together for the common good. Sarah Mitchell became more than just Saul's employer. Their professional relationship gradually deepened into something personal, built on mutual respect, shared danger, and the kind of understanding that can only develop between people who face death together and emerge stronger for the experience. But the most significant change was internal. Saul Sullivan finally began to believe that he might actually deserve the second chance he'd been given. The nightmares that had plagued him for years became less frequent. The weight of his past crimes didn't disappear, but it became bearable, balanced by the good he was accomplishing in his new life. 5 years after the showdown in Devil's Canyon, Saul Sullivan stood on the platform of the Phoenix train station, watching as another batch of criminals was loaded aboard the prison car bound for Yuma. These were members of the Cisco gang, trained robbers and murderers who'd terrorized the territory for months before Saul's investigation had brought them down. Samuel Hayes stood beside him, no longer just the sheriff of a small town, but marshal of the Arizona Territory, appointed by the territorial governor in recognition of his outstanding service to law and order. Sarah Mitchell Sullivan. She'd taken Saul's name 6 months earlier, in a ceremony performed by Samuel himself, was reviewing reports from her railroad security teams, coordinating efforts to protect the expanding rail network that was bringing civilization to the Southwest. The three of them had become more than friends or family. They'd become a symbol of what was possible when people chose to rise above their circumstances and work together for something greater than themselves. As the prison train pulled away from the station, carrying its cargo of defeated criminals toward justice, Sewell reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. From outlaw to lawman, from Solomon Morrison to Saul Sullivan, from a man running from his past to one who learned to live with it and grow beyond it. The desert wind that had once carried the sounds of gunfire and the cries of victims now brought the whistle of trains and the voices of settlers building new lives in a land that was finally becoming safe for decent people. Salvation Creek had lived up to its name, becoming not just a place of redemption for two brothers separated by fate, but a symbol of hope for an entire territory. The town that had once been just another dusty stop on the road to nowhere had become a beacon of law and order in a region where such things had once seemed impossible. But perhaps the greatest victory wasn't in the criminals captured or the crimes prevented. It was in the proof that people could change, that the past didn't have to dictate the future, and that sometimes, just sometimes, brothers separated by circumstance and reunited by destiny could find a way to heal not just their own wounds, but the wounds of the world around them. The sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and crimson that had witnessed their first confrontation years earlier. But instead of facing each other as enemies across a dusty street, Samuel and Saul Sullivan stood side by side, watching the sun go down on another day of justice served and order maintained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new criminals to catch, new problems to solve, but whatever came, they would face it together, as brothers, as partners, and as living proof that in the American West, redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it and strong enough to seize it. The legend of the Sullivan brothers would be told around campfires and in saloons for generations to come, a story of how two men born under the same stars but raised in different worlds found their way back to each other and, in doing so, found their way back to themselves. In the end, that might be the greatest victory of all.